There's lots and lots of different symptoms that we would use to think about, do you have these different traits, I suppose, or these different ways of being? I suppose a big thing to think is that just because you've managed doesn't mean that you don't have ADHD.
The thing that hit me hard was there was a piece of data that said an ADHD child is more likely to hear 20,000 more negative comments by the time they're 10 than the average child.
But I am seeing some of those people and now are coming to me, often because something has changed.
A year ago this month, I was diagnosed with ADHD, and it completely changed my life in how I understood myself and how I understood the world, my place in it. It liberated me in allowing myself to forgive myself for all of the things that I couldn't explain, and gave me a whole new level of self-awareness. And with that in mind, I really wanted to find a way to help other people like me understand their condition. The problem is there's just so much conflicting data and research on ADHD, and it's hard to know what resources do we believe and trust. So I thought to myself, I need to find the perfect speaker to come and talk about this subject with me that could be trusted for the wider ADHD community. So with that in mind, I couldn't think of a better person to bring on than the person I trust more than anyone in the world on this topic, Dr Burman Roy. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
We have such brilliant conversations about all the possibilities of ADHD, and I think so many people could benefit from hearing those conversations. But before we kick in, for those that don't know much about you, can you give us a bit of history on what led you to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a general adult psychiatrist. You have to excuse my voice. So I'm a general adult psychiatrist, which means that I don't just deal with ADHD. And I suppose I started my training in London and worked in various NHS hospitals, community teams, seeing mental health of all different sorts. And as I was doing it, I think a few of the jobs that I did, it seemed that again and again, there were a lot of things coming up around people who were struggling with focus, concentration, with sort of difficulties with regulating their mood. And there are loads and loads of different diagnoses that are applied to that. But I think, ADHD was something that people were just starting to sort of talk about and think about in terms of adults, or not just starting to, but it was happening more and more. So I did some training at one of the national centres in terms of ADHD, and just found it really, really interesting. And then when I started working in the private sector, and I've worked both in the NHS and private sector and the private sector for years, I started to see more and more ADHD in the private sector. And so now I am working in a clinic where I'm sort of leading up the ADHD service there. And that's the main thing that I do currently.
For the purposes of people that are still really new to what ADHD is, in simple terms, can you explain what it is?
Yeah, so it's not that simple. But I suppose the thing that I think of with ADHD, there's different types of ADHD. So there's an inattentive subtype of ADHD, which we say is mainly about sort of difficulties with focusing and concentrating. There is a hyperactive or impulsive subtype of ADHD, which is much more about sort of having a lot of restlessness and struggling to regulate how you respond to things. And then there's a combined subtype of ADHD where we think you've got both inattentive and hyperactive. And if you sort of put it together, we say you've got combined. So that's what it is. And there's lots and lots of different symptoms that we would use to think about, do you have these different traits, I suppose, or these different ways of being? And then we try and get a sense of, and how does that affect you? So, you could have those traits, but it doesn't really bother you. You get by. Or that could really have an impact on your functioning. And that functioning could be either at work or in your studies. It might not be anything to do with that. It might be about how you interact with people, how you view yourself. And so that's the bit that I suppose is a disorder bit. So that does it get in the way? So have you got these sort of traits? Do they get in the way? That's really the core of, I suppose, what ADHD is.
I heard someone refer to it as, it's like driving a Porsche with slow brakes.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I can understand that, because I think it, exactly, you've just got so much energy, possibly so much drive, but I think it's hard to always catch yourself and regulate where you should put that. So I think someone once said to me that actually what ADHD really is a syndrome of extremes. It's sort of like you're all in or you're all out. It's that. And I think that's about impulse regulation and struggling to manage how you respond to things. So yeah, I think the Porsche with no brakes makes sense.
Do you agree with the terminology hyperactive and inattentive?
So I think it's a lot of stuff put into one. I think that's the thing about ADHD. And who knows where that will go. And in the past, you had like attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity disorder, and they're sort of put together. And I think a lot of people have still talk about ADD, attention deficit disorder. And we don't really use that term anymore, but we use the inattentive subtype instead. But I think it's just a lot of stuff put together. So it's definitely relevant, or bits of it are relevant for different people. So I think sort of, some people will completely say that their whole focus is a lack of focus, that they can't concentrate on anything, and it's all about inattention. I think typically it's the reason that you can't focus is that you're distracted.
Yeah.
And either you're distracted by your own mind or you're distracted by the world around you. But it's more I suppose distraction is why you are inattentive. But I think inattention is very relevant. Hyperactive, I think, is, you got to think traditionally where this description and this diagnosis came from was mainly with kids and sort of describing kids. And I think you could see that hyperactivity a lot more in certain children. I think in adults, you don't necessarily always see the hyperactivity so much. I think it's not socially acceptable. People find ways to direct it. Some people will, be doing huge amounts of sports. Some people won't be doing anything like that. It'll just come out as restlessness and fidgeting and sort of, or they'll suppress it and it causes an internal sort of turmoil. So I think hyperactivity is very relevant and descriptive for children. For adults, it's probably still relevant, but you just don't see it as much. It's not sort of perceived as much.
That makes sense. What about ADHD in relation to gender? Do you think it impacts men and women differently, or how it presents itself?
So I think, obviously there's a big conversation going on around this now in society. I think traditionally the idea was that there's a lot more inattentive ADHD in women. I'm not sure if that's true. I'm not sure if that's strictly true. I think that, again, it's about what's sort of acceptable. So I think when you're young, particularly, boisterous young boys sort of get away with it. But quite often if girls behave like that, that's maybe frowned upon. Or it might go the other way, that boisterous young boys become really problematic and they're sort of seen as being really naughty and they sort of get into trouble. And that means that medical services are brought into play. Can we get this person assessed? Whilst with girls, they might be really talkative and that might be quite liked in some way. But I think more often than not, what happens is that, especially when you've got kids who want to be good kids, if they've got this tendency and they see that it's disapproved of, and I suppose I'm talking about young girls here, they might shut that down a lot more. And so I think it can look a lot more like inattentive when maybe their sort of restlessness and the hyperactivity is sort of suppressed a bit more.
Because of society and what's expected of them.
Yeah, I think so. I think with all of this, it's like an interaction between what you have inside and the world that you live in. And I think it's hard to say if there is definitely more inattentive ADHD than a sort of combined or hyperactive ADHD in women. I think it certainly does come out, or it does seem to appear in different ways.
So to those at home that think they might have ADHD, what are the common patterns or examples that you can think of that they might be able to relate to?
So, I suppose a big thing to think is that just because you've managed doesn't mean that you don't have ADHD. I think that's a really important thing, because I think a lot of people, sometimes you hear this term of scaffolding, that particularly when you're young, you might not always present in a disordered way. Like, you've got all the traits. So this is who you are, and you've got certain ways of being. But actually, because you've got really good, maybe school around you, or you've got a really good family, or you're just really smart, actually, and school's not that hard in lots of ways, or you want to be really good, and that's the only thing that sort of defines you as being good because everything else in your world is terrible. So you put loads of work into studies. All of these things can sort of protect you and can mean that you do okay. But then I'll often see people when all of that's taken away, so when they go to uni or when they start the world of work, that they really start struggling. And I have to say, actually, I think I see it a lot in the academic world, because I think the nature of ADHD is that because it's about dopamine and sort of reward pathways, if you're getting a day-to-day reward, say in the world of work, like I do some work and my boss thinks it's great, or I have a really good time with my colleagues, or the work itself is really well received, that's a bit of a dopamine hit. And so that can keep you motivated and keep you engaged. I think quite often in the world of studies and uni and things like that, there's just massive gaps between I have to work for this and then I've got an exam, or I have to hand in a piece of coursework and it's not going to come back for ages. And it's almost like there's too much time. And so I think that often a lot of the students that I see who are struggling with ADHD, it's not just that there's this sort of transition to a world where they haven't got that scaffolding around them. It's also this delay in a response between me doing something, it being good or not good, and me getting some feedback on it. I think that's particularly challenging for people with ADHD.
What about things like RSD? What is RSD?
So this is this idea of rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And essentially, if you think, so what we think is happening in ADHD is the frontal part of the brain, or one part of the brain, it is the part of the brain that we think is one of the parts of the brain that we think is involved in or is affected in ADHD. Now, that part of the brain, it helps you to regulate your impulses. So say, for example, I want to work on something, but then an idea pops into my mind of like, oh, wouldn't it be more interesting to check this, that, the other? Or I see something over there. Let's say I'm having a conversation with you and somebody else is having a conversation over there, and I can't help but look around, and then I can't stop listening to that conversation. I can't have our conversation. So all of this is like, I'm getting distracted because of impulse regulation. I can't regulate my impulses. So you can think of that in terms of concentration, attention, hyperactivity, impulsivity. But it's the same thing for emotions. So someone says something to me, or someone looks at me in a funny way, or I do something and somebody doesn't say thank you in the right sort of way. And all these things that you sort of know are perhaps not big things, they trigger a very big emotional response. And, you know, I'm sure we've all experienced this regardless of ADHD. For any of us, if your emotions, if something winds you up, but your emotions are like 10%, 15%, it doesn't really matter to you that much, you can deal with it. You can think with your, you can use your mind, exactly. You can use your logic to kick in and say, not right now, I didn't sleep last night, that person, that's their issues, whatever it is. You can think it through, you can manage it. But for all of us in this world, if your emotions are at 90%, it's really, really hard. It's not that you can't use your mind, but you're playing a lot of catch up. You quite often use your mind to not show it to the rest of the world, but inside you're sort of getting eaten up. So it's that we think happens more quickly in ADHD. So your impulse regulation is poor, so therefore you go from 0 to 90 in a second. And this is this idea of rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So essentially, that's what it says, that you feel rejected or hurt, or in some sense you don't feel you got the reaction, or things haven't gone well. And then you have this real sense of dysphoria or sadness or upset or anxiety or whatever it is, but you have a very strong emotional or anger. You have a really strong emotional reaction to a situation that doesn't make sense. So another really good example, or a really common example I see, is parents with their kids. And they'll quite often say to me, like, I just don't understand why I keep losing my temper, and I don't want to, and I give myself a pep talk and I do all the things, and then suddenly they tip me over the edge. Like loads of parents without ADHD feel like that too. Yeah. So it's not an ADHD, I'm not saying that's exclusively ADHD. I think the whole thing is all of these things are a spectrum, and it's about you're not just having one single symptom and I say, oh, they've got ADHD. It's the whole picture. as it builds up. But that's another example where often I'll see people sort of say, can't manage my emotions, and it comes out in that way.
I think I've said to you before, sometimes I have the opposite extreme where I'm so excited. There's so much stuff going on and I've got to do everything now. Yeah. And I get myself into a state of being really wired.
Yeah.
And I know, I'm saying to myself, I'm saying to people like that, I'm wired, I'm not regulated.
Yeah.
And I can't seem to control it or prevent it or slow it down. I try the mindful colouring, I try exercise, I try and take myself out of the situation, and it will play its course. I'm trapped in this wired episode for a few hours until it comes out the other side. And this is where I'm really open in my business, and I'll say to the team, guys, I'm having one of those days, so I'm just going to avoid it, or you're all going to be extra productive today, so I'm just going to keep my distance. But I don't often hear people talking about this. They talk a lot about RSD.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a term for what I'm describing.
I don't think there is, actually. I mean, I don't think there is. I think you could think of it as a different type of RSD. I mean, it's not dysphoria, is it? It's sort of, I was going to say it's euphoria, but it's probably not. It's not like a sort of happiness, because sometimes it is, but sometimes it's actually just like frantic.
Yeah.
So I think it can be both ways. But I think it's just this sort of, again, being unable to say that's enough. And, I suppose one of the when I started speaking, I was saying one of the things I found really interesting was that there were these big fluctuations in mood that I would keep seeing in general mental health. So people would be diagnosed with bipolar affective disorder or with personality disorders, or all sorts of variations on that. And sometimes you feel, I'm not sure if those diagnoses fit. And, diagnoses do change with time when people come to see different psychiatrists and get different opinions. But for me, ADHD sometimes, and I don't want to oversell it, because I think, it's not that those other diagnoses are not relevant. They're very relevant for a lot of people. But for some people, I think you can get an almost manic presentation with ADHD, where you're getting really built up really sort of into something, and then almost overexcited, and you can't stop it, you can't catch it. And often you've been criticised for that. I was just thinking, as I said that word, overexcited. I mean, how many people have been told, calm down throughout their lives? And it becomes a real sort of...
You're being intense.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. There's a real sense of like shame and baggage can come with
Triggers RSD.
Triggers. It all just goes round and round and round, yeah. But yeah, I think that, so we see that. I suppose the big thing that I would say is that quite often with ADHD, they're quite sort of brief things. So it might be like a few hours or a day. I think if you've got a situation that's pushing you hard, that's keeping it going, it might go on for a few days, but generally it's pretty brief. Unlike some other mental disorders like bipolar affective disorder, where it can go on for weeks or months.
We're not going to get through this without addressing the elephant in the room, right? There's been a lot of bad publicity for ADHD this year, where there's obviously been an increase in diagnoses, but then the BBC did that documentary that was so helpful for the ADHD community, about people being misdiagnosed. What's your take on this?
I think the documentary, the value of it, I think, is that it is really important that you have proper assessment and diagnosis, particularly if you're thinking about medication. But even not, okay, the medications are one thing, but even just being told what's going on for you and having a way that you explain your experience, it's got to be accurate. So I think diagnosis is important. And so I suppose trying to expose things that are not best practice is a good idea. So that's the good bit. I suppose that the negative bit is that where does it come from? There's a lack of services within the NHS. People are really struggling. They're seeking help in the best way they can. And so I think a lot of people are obviously turning to the private sector. I think what you need in documentaries like that is perhaps a bit more balance than it showed.
The counter.
Yeah, because I think, I feel it sort of painted a bit of a picture where it didn't look like, it sort of looked like a diagnosis through the NHS was legitimate and good. And outside of that, it was all sort of questionable, which I don't think is really fair. I think a lot of those people who are working within the NHS, as I was for years, are also working in the private sector. So it's quite often the same people, and we're not going to just do something terrible in the private sector or do whatever is wanted. I think what's been unhelpful, clearly, is that then a lot of people who have really got these diagnoses that have made a massive difference to them either started being questioned by other people or questioned it themselves. And I've seen a lot of that where people have come for second opinions, and I've been saying, I don't think you really need a second opinion. The first opinion was valid. So I think it's just that there needed to be that balance. And maybe that happens in the conversation afterwards rather than the documentary itself. But I think the reality is, they have effects. So these documentaries have effects.
I even experienced that myself. People question the integrity of my diagnosis because it was at a time when it's all kicking off and everyone's getting their diagnosis, right? So even I experienced that, and it's not a nice feeling when you finally found the piece to yourself, and then someone says, "But is it a real piece, or did you do something to get that?" So I can really relate to that, and I think that's what made me feel sad, is that all of these people that finally got their answers then had to defend their diagnosis to the people around them.
Absolutely. And
you hear people making jokes, oh, you're another one that's been diagnosed. And it is interesting. What do you think's caused the boom in people getting diagnosed?
So I suppose on one side, probably was underdiagnosis before. And so there's a swing back. But I think that probably doesn't explain, or maybe it doesn't explain the full amount of people who are coming forward. I think it goes back to this idea of, is it a disorder or isn't it? And I think probably what happened is that you've got a whole load of people who have got the difficulties of ADHD, like the traits, like I've got difficulties with concentration and focus. I make lots of silly mistakes when I don't mean to. They might have some of the restlessness things, but they've managed it. And then you get put in a situation that is really challenging, and suddenly you can't manage it anymore. And I suppose what I'm talking about is the pandemic. I think that had a huge impact for a lot of people, where everything that people were doing before was suddenly taken away. You couldn't meet your friends, you couldn't go for a run if that's what you did. You were remote working and staring at a screen. So I think a lot of people were really triggered by that, and it made their symptoms a lot worse. And perhaps it sort of, for the first time in their lives, it looked like a disorder. But then when they looked back, they could see, well, this is the thing that I've always struggled with. This has sort of been like the magnifying glass to look at it. But I recognise these are chronic challenges that I have. I suppose that's part of our job when we're doing an assessment. And that's why, a good assessment should be really long and should take a lot of time for people to consider your whole life. Because you're trying to get that pattern. Even if it hasn't always caused significant impairment, hasn't been getting in the way in lots of ways, you should have had those symptoms always. Because the other thing is, anybody who's depressed, anybody who's anxious, they're going to struggle with focus and concentration. They're going to quite often be really restless and fidgety if they're very anxious. So those symptoms you can get secondary to depression and anxiety. It doesn't mean it's ADHD. But if it's just come on suddenly when you're in an episode of depression or anxiety, then that's not ADHD. But if you've always had it and then actually just got really depressed and anxious and that was like the result of your ADHD, it's getting that sort of life course that helps us to work out what, not always, but try and work out what was chicken and what's egg.
I guess the thing that I love about this is that you're quite open-minded in the fact of, does it matter if it's neurological or childhood trauma or whatever it is, if you've got the symptoms and there's a way to treat it, then that's what matters. And I was like, wow, that's really refreshing to hear that point of view. Do you think ADHD is purely a neurological thing you're born with, or can it be a symptom of childhood trauma?
Okay, so I think that probably it's a mixture of the two. So I think that a lot of people will have a biological predisposition to have difficulties with concentration, focus, restlessness, and that's probably about their biological makeup. Traditionally, we thought that was all about dopamine and noradrenaline. I think that still is the main idea. That's what all the ADHD meds are based around. But, perhaps someone's more prone to anxiety, and that's more about serotonin and a different sort of mechanism. But actually, when they get really anxious, what they struggle with is focus and concentration. So it might be there's different things involved, but I think that for a lot of people, there is a sort of biological element to it. But where trauma can come in then is it's almost like the trigger point. You know, you could maybe have managed it. Say if you, I don't know, were in a really loving family, went to a really good school, had a really good social network around you, people are, everybody cared and supported you. Then even from a young age, some people who had this biological predisposition might have been able to get enough strategies and structures in place that they can manage it and it never reaches a disorder point. I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, and I think that is important. I think some people are so biologically impaired that even from a very young age, with all of that support in place, it's really hard and it's really clear. But I think, if you've got all that in place, then maybe you're okay. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you've got the other side, that you, instead of having that supportive world around you, you're subject to loads of really difficult situations, either abusive situations or neglectful, or actually parents who are just not there, they're just away with other things and they can't be there for you. And you just don't learn strategies, you don't learn how to regulate your emotions, then maybe that contributes to your biological predisposition and can be a major factor in sort of the ADHD coming out. So I think that's how I would see the two as connected.
So I have quite a controversial opinion, and it is just my opinion, but I tend to be around a lot of ADHD people now. We'll come back to that. Yeah. But the pattern I'm seeing is that there is some kind of neurodiversity that runs in their family. So either a parent has it, or they might be dyslexic or autistic. But I'm yet to meet an ADHD person that has a neurodiversity where there's someone in their family that doesn't also have some kind of neurodiversity. Mm. Is that possible?
As in, is it possible for a person to have ADHD where there's no neurodiversity in their family?
Yes. Or is it genetic?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. That's the traditional idea, is that it's very genetic and that it runs biologically in families. And, it may not run in families, but a lot of the traits do, and that it is very biological. So definitely that's been the traditional model. I think the idea of there being a significant sort of trauma component with some people is perhaps a newer idea and a bit more controversial. But I think what you're saying in terms of that biological bit and having family members with it is really what we traditionally thought. So definitely that happens. Whether someone can have it when they have nobody in their family can have it, I mean, anything can happen.
It's also interesting that it seems to be, if they've got ADHD in their family, they might have dyslexia or autism. It's not like that the whole family is pure ADHD. It's that there seems to be a thread of it, the family being neurodiverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I personally, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that's about, like why there is this association, but there's definitely a huge overlap. As in, I'm not sure in terms of what's happening biologically, why there's that similarity, but there's definitely a huge overlap we see with people who've got, exactly as you said, dyslexia, autism, ADHD, quite often have the same person having all of these things or some of these things.
I often tell people, well, like my daughter, for example, she's 2, nearly 3, and I found her a school that had like a neurodiverse department that could really support her. And people say, how do you know she's ADHD? She's not diagnosed. And I'm like, trust me, I know. But I also believe that if I am quite high in the spectrum for ADHD, and so is her father, then there's a really strong possibility that she is, regardless of whether I believe I can see the behaviour or not. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable to think, if you've got certain traits, both of you, then it's likely she's going to have those traits. Maybe biologically, maybe also by nurture, right? You've got certain ways of behaving. You're trying your best not to, but you do those things.
She's a little mirror. Yeah.
And so she picks up those things. So I think there's a lot of that as well. But definitely biologically, there's a high likelihood. I think the only thing with young children is that also a lot of young children are like that when they're younger, and it changes with time. So I think we watch it, we see what happens.
Have you heard of the term high functioning ADHD? I'm hearing this a lot lately. Is that an official term?
I don't think it's an official term, but I definitely know what you mean.
Yeah, so she's too advanced for her age, memorises books, can count, knows the months of the year, well before her age. It's the higher functioning that gives her away. It's also being socially awkward, taking her to a park and her just walking up to another kid and giving them a hug. It's very cute and endearing at this age, I'm sure. But one thing that I found really alarming when I was researching how I can show up better as a mother to an ADHD child, the thing that hit me hard was there was a piece of data that said an ADHD child is more likely to hear 20,000 more negative comments by the time they're 10 than the average child. Do you think there's truth in that?
I suspect because you are more impulsive and you struggle to regulate that impulse more, then you're likely to, I suppose, rub people up in the wrong way more often than someone else. So I think there is, a chance. I think I can understand where that idea, where that stat would come from.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I have another question for you that you're not going to like. Medication. There's people that say, no, don't do it. And there's people that are like, why wouldn't you? And it seems to be really controversial, especially within the ADHD community. There's those that are wholeheartedly against it and those that really believe in the power of it. What's your belief?
I think people have the right to choose. And I think it's a tool. For most people, it's a tool. I think there are some people with ADHD who, their lives have been completely derailed in lots of ways. I think often there are other factors that mean that they haven't had, we're talking about the support and the social structure and whatever else it may be. We think there's a huge amount of ADHD prevalence in the prison service. So a lot of people who are offenders are felt to have ADHD. And it may be about poor impulse regulation being combined with, a lack of social support, being exposed to certain situations, drugs coming into the mix, all those sorts of things. So if you've got that sort of population, then maybe drugs are really, really useful because actually it can change the whole course of their life, possibly. So I think, everybody can choose. I think it's everybody's choice whether they want to go down the route of medication or not. I think it all depends upon how much you're struggling. And I think there are some people who definitely would meet the threshold for a disorder, but they have managed to create a world around them that works in terms of their ADHD. I suppose a lot of people that I see who are entrepreneurs in different ways, there's a reason they've got into it. And I see a lot of them, not all of them hugely successful, but, people who are trying to do things their own way, often because they can't fit into the conventional way of doing things. Now, but if you've managed to create that world, then do you need medication? Maybe you don't. Maybe you can employ other strategies and techniques. On the other hand, if you're someone who's really stuck in a certain situation, and I think, it's easy to say, well, get out of the situation, but I think you've got a couple of kids, you've got financial responsibilities, it's not easy to change your world. And you're repeatedly having difficulties because of ADHD. So an example I can think of is I've seen so many people who have come to see me who've had repeated episodes of depression, anxiety. I don't think that's the majority. That's the majority of people who are seeking help. I don't think that they're going to go down that route or are thinking that way. I just think that they're quite useful medications for a lot of people.
I can see why it can have a positive impact on you because I'm more productive, I get more stuff done, I regulate better, I'm more centered in myself. I can see why that can be addictive. But yeah, I barely remember to take them. I can't see it being another type of recreational drug in that respect. Let's switch gears now.
Okay.
So for me personally, someone that puts a lot of content out into the world, I'm very public about the fact that I'm ADHD. Mainly because I've, without knowing, hired a load of neurodiverse people and birthed an ADHD child that it feels like the right thing to do, to own it and create a space for other people to say, this is what I need, or I'm having a bad day. And I learned from meeting other content creators that talk about this subject that it feels like there's a divide in the ADHD community of those that believe their condition is a disability and those that really reject it being called a disability or a disorder and see it as a superpower and a strength. What's your belief?
I just think that both could be true in a sense, which I know may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I feel it's really... I think the thing is that the whole discussion around ADHD comes from a place of disorder. It comes from medics, psychologists who are trying to help people who are struggling and then describe this thing, but they describe it as a disorder because those are the people who they're seeing. But you could have a whole group of people who have the same traits but have been able to use it really effectively and have succeeded. Well, we never see them.
Yeah.
Because why would they come to me?
Yeah.
So for those people, it is a superpower. I suppose it could be a superpower for some, but it's a superpower as long as everything's going well. So I suppose a real example I can give of this is that I am seeing some people who are like in 40s, 50s, 60s, who have been very successful all their lives, would never have thought of ADHD. You know, they might have heard about ADHD. Even now, you know, I'll meet some people, say some doctors who are colleagues of mine, and will say, well, of course I've got ADHD, but they don't think they've got a disorder. They just know that I've got all these traits, but I'm really successful. And this has helped me in a long way. But I am seeing some of those people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who've been really successful all their lives, and now are coming to me saying that I think I might have a disorder. Now, why are they coming to me? Often because something has changed, and now they can see this whole pattern of their life where maybe they've battled against it, and on some level it's really helped them. On another level it's been problematic, but they've sort of managed, and that's me, and that's me. But then eventually something happens where they can't manage anymore. So a really simple example might be that suddenly all my administrative support disappears. You know, I've been running my own business for years. And then how do you function? You can't function. You're like thousands of pounds in debt because you can't submit an invoice, so you're doing all the work. You know, that sort of thing really everything can collapse. Another really big thing, I've mentioned it a few times, is children. So I'll see people who are really successful who will say, it's so sad. I sit and I watch my husband or my wife playing with the kids. I just can't play because I can't focus. I can't concentrate. This is so upsetting for me, and I want help with that. And I recognize it's just one thing in all the other things that I've struggled with. And that's a really important point again, is that just that symptom in isolation, you wouldn't say that's ADHD, but that with the whole story someone tells you, I think that can help you to think, okay, it looks like a disorder now, even though for the last 30 years, it's looked like a superpower.
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm saying it can be both. I think the whole argument or the whole conversation is around whether this is a trait that you have that can at times become a disordered state.
Yeah.
You know, that like just things around you come together and suddenly this thing becomes overwhelming. For some people, I think their whole lives, it means that they're in a sense in a place of disorder. But I think, to be honest, I think for the majority, that's not the case. I think the majority, it sort of goes in and out.
I think so for me, my belief is that the fact that my team will say I have a crystal ball, and they all say that I can see things are going to happen, but I can see the domino effect of if this happens, then this is going to happen. And I'm very good at seeing systems and how things connect. And in a way where people around me are like, I didn't even thought, it's a lot of that. The other thing that I do that will drive my team mad is I immediately pick up their energy, their body language. I'm like, what's wrong? Stop it, leave me alone. And the other thing is my creativity and how I see opportunities, how I'm then able to put a strategy in place and execute it and so forth. The fact that I'm able to take risks and I don't have something in me that says, is that wise? Should you? No, it, I'm going to do it and I'll deal with the consequences afterwards. I see strengths in my ADHD. And the thing for me is raising a child, knowing she's ADHD and she doesn't have her diagnosis yet. I'm not going to bring her up to say you have a disorder or you're disabled. I'm going to bring her up to say you're wired differently.
Yeah.
And that means that you'll struggle in these things, but you're going to excel at these things.
Exactly.
because I just can't buy into the idea of raising a child, telling them they're broken or something's wrong with them. That doesn't feel right for me. That's not how I empower my child to manage her ADHD. So that when she's my age, she won't need to rely on medication because I've taught her the coping mechanisms to manage it, right? So I guess my question is, are there positive attributes that come with ADHD?
Yeah, and I think you've just described them like really well. You know, what you were describing as you were talking about it, I was just thinking really biologically, what you are describing there, I think, is what we talk about being the default mode network. So it's sort of like the background activity that's going on in the brain, which is essentially various parts of the brain being connected. That's active in people when you're not focused on something. So all of us have that going on. But we think it's a bit louder in people with ADHD, and it doesn't switch off so much when you focus on one thing. So that's the problem with distraction, because actually I've got all these other things going on in my head, but it's also creativity, because suddenly I've got all this stuff that I'm pulling on whilst I'm trying to concentrate on that one problem. Catch me on a good day, that's really creative. Catch me on a bad day and I can't focus and I'm just, completely distracted. That could also be relevant for that emotional intuition you were talking about. Perhaps what's going on is you're also referencing so many different experiences you've had, interactions you've had with people, and therefore you're being able to see connections that someone else couldn't see. Or perhaps just because you are not focusing on doing your piece of work, you're watching what everybody else is doing in the room and you're noticing it, So there could be so many ways that it could contribute. And so I think really being able to think creatively is often a really powerful thing for a lot of people with ADHD. We're talking about this side, but the restlessness, the energy levels, if it's focused in the right way, it's hugely useful. I mean, I see a lot of people in sports who've got ADHD or who've had ADHD, or who were in sports and have ADHD. And it was hugely useful for them. They were able to keep going when other people couldn't, because on one side, they couldn't stop.
Yeah.
Sometimes they end up with injuries, and that's the problem side of it. But, there's possibly a good side to it as well. I think what you said about the conversation with your daughter is really important. And I think it's really important to highlight, because I also think it's really important for us as well to think with our children that is where I think it's more useful to almost, as long as you can I suspend the idea of disability and just see these as traits? I think you also have to temper that with, is someone really struggling? Is the child really struggling? Are they falling behind in school? Are they not being able to make friends because of their behaviour? Then, you have to think about it differently. But if they're not, if they're sort of getting by, but you know that they've got these certain traits, then yes, I agree with you. You sort of, just like any parent would with any sort of personality traits, I think before we had these things, we talk about our families like this, and this is how we manage this bit of us. So I think it's giving them those skills.
There's so much conflicting research, and one person will believe this, another person will believe that. But the general consensus that I hear is that a lot of the research is outdated because it was focused on little boys as opposed to adults and females.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I think that a lot of, there's just so much research done before on sort of young boys. So it doesn't cover the full picture. I think that's true. And I'm sure that I know that there are people who are working on that now, and as in trying to sort of rectify that balance and get a more of a rounded picture. But definitely a lot of the information we have had has been mainly from that group.
I think going back to disability or superpower, the thing for me is people knowing they have ADHD, regardless of whether they're managing or not, can give them a lot more self-awareness, because they can forgive themselves for things that they've never been able to control, right? And I guess my question is, I remember I read something from the ADHD Foundation. They posted an article talking about, is it a broken mind or is it just wired differently? And it's a shame that you can only get recognised for ADHD if it is hindering you in life.
Yeah.
But I think there's just power in people knowing, regardless of whether they want the medication or not. So I guess what I keep toying with is, are we framing it right?
No, I completely hear that. And I just don't know from what angle would you catch it and frame it differently? I suppose you could do like psychometric testing if people wanted to know that I've got this personality type. And so I've got a sort of neurodiverse type. You could look at it from that angle, and maybe people would access that in education or in schooling or in work, or you could just get it done for yourself and it might be helpful. And there's definitely, I can see the value in that, of course. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's come from this place of being, as I was saying before, it's come from disorder. It's come from us describing people who are in the most extreme end and who are suffering as a result of that. So, yeah, I think there would be value to that.
I think the hardest thing for me when I got diagnosed, and someone made a joke and went, "Oh, you're disabled." And I'm like, well, I've built an 8-figure company I'm on my own now, running this company, and I have a child. Bloody love my life. I'm very happy, and I'm very proud of my journey. I don't feel disabled.
Yeah.
And that's what. Yes, there are parts of my ADHD that can be disabling. I'm aware when I'm in an ADHD episode. And even though I'm very aware and my logical brain is engaged and I can hear it, I can't stop it. And those things are and can be disabling.
Yeah.
But surely I can't be classed as someone with a neurological disability if I'm able to live a happy life and be successful, is my belief, I guess.
So, but what you are almost speaking to is the argument of overdiagnosis, is that actually, this would be one of the arguments, is that unless you have that level of disability, then is it the disorder that we had traditionally described, or are you now talking about what you were just saying before, that we should have a different way of approaching it, but it shouldn't be medics, it shouldn't be psychologists who are coming from a disorder approach giving you that diagnosis. And then I suppose comes the question, should you have access to medication? If you're not suffering in that way, then do you need a treatment, or do you need psychological strategies and different ways of doing things and suggestions? I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a really interesting and really true point. And I do, I completely understand that, because I think a lot of the time the conversation that I end up having with people is, I think we have to think of it as a spectrum, and how severely, I suppose, how many of these symptoms and traits do you have? How much does it impact upon your life? We're supposed to do an annual ADHD review once people are on medications. That's the sort of minimum they should have. Part of that review is to think about if you need medication. Even if it were a long-standing neurological thing, why would we be doing these reviews for medication unless there could be a variation in people's level of functional impairment?
I come across this piece of research that basically said that ADHD people back in caveman times, the ADHD person would be the leader of that tribal group because they were on high alert, looking for risks, quick problem solvers, get stuff done, high energy, can look after a pack.
Yeah, could be. They could also be the outcast of the group because they're just winding everyone up.
Because they're annoying, yeah.
So, I don't know. I think it could go both ways. I think I suppose, but what that speaks to is that it's not in isolation. It's ADHD does not define you. Yeah. It definitely, of course, is a really important part of people. And I think I really enjoy, to be honest, working with ADHD and people who are suffering with ADHD or people who have ADHD, because I think nearly everybody I see, it's a really validating explanation for what's gone on for them, whether they think it's a disorder or not. And we're talking about this spectrum idea, and with so many people, I'll sort of say, I think you're sort of on the borderline of do you have it or don't you have it? And let's think that through and how you want to approach it. And do we say you've got the diagnosis? Because, having a diagnosis can potentially have negative things, it might affect your insurance or all sorts of stuff. So do you want that? Do you
want it? It's good to know.
So ADHD, it's a really validating or it can be a really validating diagnosis or explanation for people. But I think it's really important to remember that even then, it's not all of you. You know, not everybody with ADHD is the same.
Yeah, it manifests differently, and it depends what level of ADHD you are as well, right?
And also just what you've experienced in life. If you have won at everything because of your ADHD, you're very different to someone whose ADHD got them into trouble at school, meant they couldn't get a job, ended up, I don't know, committing a crime or whatever. That's a completely different experience. So you can't say it's the ADHD that did all of that. It's just one piece.
I watched a piece of content saying that the reason ADHD children are struggling in school is because the education system just wasn't built for them. It was built for neurotypical children, and that if they made changes to the system, ADHD children wouldn't find themselves in detention so much or the victim of bullies and so forth. But it's a society problem, not necessarily the problem of neurodivergence.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. You know, a classic example is you have a kid who's really sort of hyper and disruptive in class. What's the punishment? You don't get to go out for playtime. He needs to go out for playtime. That's the whole point. That's what he needs. Needs to burn off. Or I'm saying she needs to burn off that energy. You know, that's just a classic example of it. Or say, for example, you've got the kid in class who you've got chemistry and they're being told what you have to do for the experiment. The moment the teacher stops talking, they turn around to their friend and say, what are we doing? You know, well, maybe it was best not to just give them a whole load of instructions. Writing it down, having an external representation quite often of something is very useful. I think it's often really hard to hold things in mind with ADHD because your mind's going in so many different places, and so many people with ADHD, one of the most simple strategies is keep that list. You know, and people do it, but then you forget the list, obviously, and 10 lists. But still, you know, on some level, that's useful. So yes, I think there is that. But then you've got to think, I suppose the other side of the coin is, well, how about all the neurotypical people? How do you create a system that sort of balances and is fair to all? It's never easy.
It's not. I saw this reel of a teacher talking about an ADHD little boy that he had in his class.
Yeah.
And he said he had an agreement with the teacher upstairs that he would get this little boy to take an empty envelope and tell him, you've got to deliver a top secret to Mrs. such and such upstairs. And he said, and that gives him an opportunity to come out of the classroom, tap a bit on the lockers, sort about a bit in the hallway, go up to the teacher, and he feels like he's proud, he's done something valuable. But he then doesn't have to explain to all the neurotypical children that this child needs to be taken out to protect them so they're not disrupted, so that he can also let out his energy. And I just thought that's just so wonderful that he's gone to that level to really think about how he can accommodate that little boy and settle him and let him get his energy out and protect the rest of the class without embarrassing him in the process. I thought that was really sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's brilliant.
So for the people watching this that suspect they might have ADHD or they are considering a diagnosis, what tips could you give them with some of the struggles that they might be experiencing?
So yeah, I suppose that the thing that's the most helpful to do is the most unhelpful to say, in a sense, which is that you need to find ways to concentrate and focus. Now, it's sort of like telling the anxious person, don't be anxious. Yeah. But it's almost trying to reconceptualize it as, you know, this is something that's a challenge for you, but you are not a failure because you've not been able to do that. You have been able to do that in certain settings. Like hyperfocus is a huge thing. So how do you get a bit more control over that? How do you get a bit more control over applying it? And treating it as a skill and training, you know, and being quite kind to yourself when you can't do it, and not getting too frustrated. All of these things I appreciate really hard to do, but I think that is the core of it. So it's sort of finding a way to align interest with activity. You know, regardless of ADHD, people don't want to do stuff when it means nothing to them. But if you can find a way of making the task meaningful, then suddenly it's more engaging.
Game.
Make it a game.
That always works for me. Deadlines and games.
Exactly.
Putting me in some kind of stress or pressure, I'll excel at it. I'll hyper-focus on it and over-deliver it because you've told me there's a deadline to do.
I spoke to someone recently who, so when he works on a project, he's all in that project. His sort of house becomes a complete mess. He can't even think about it, but he's got it in his mind. At the moment my project finishes, the first thing I'm going to do is sort out my house. And then what happens is he finishes his project and then he just sits there staring at his house, feeling overwhelmed, feeling terrible about himself, and sometimes sinks into a bit of a depression. I think it's really this idea that, you've got ADHD, you are not a marathon runner, you're a sprinter. So do the sprint. And after the sprint, take a rest, go away from your house, go on holiday for a bit. I don't know, go away for the weekend. Because if you stay in that flat, you're going to stay in it and stare at it and be miserable. It's better to just remove yourself, get out of the situation, and then come back with a deadline. Invite your friends over for Friday evening. So then you've got to get it done, and you will get it done. You've had that break. You're ready for the next sprint. So it's sort of not finding a way to roll with it and use it.
Yeah. This was going to be my other question, and I don't know if my understanding is correct, so please let me know, but I call it an ADHD episode for a start. I don't know if that's the right language. Is that correct?
So I suppose it goes back to that idea of, is it a chronic trait that is always a state, that you're always in an ADHD state, or could you be someone who's almost neurodiverse and then there are periods where you get pushed into it being more like an episode of ADHD, and that's controversial. Or I don't know if it's controversial, but there's conversation around.
So my belief is that I'm aware when I'm in an episode, and my hyperactive episodes tend to take place in the morning, where I get a lot of stuff done and drive the team mad. And then after lunch, I start to kind of slip into inattentive, and that's where I tend to do better, more like strategic projects or mapping out information where I can just sit quietly on my own and so forth. But if I have to engage and be around people, the hyperactive is normally a better vibe for me. But it then leads me to believe that I can brain hack to a degree. So I can switch out different tasks to match the type of episode I might be in and use my episode to optimize it. Do you think that that's possible? Absolutely.
Why not? I think that definitely everybody has these fluctuations in when they're good in certain situations at certain times. You're more prone to that with ADHD, definitely having periods where you're more energetic and are often being followed by a slump. So I think if you found a way to use that, then I would definitely, I completely agree. That's probably, that's real and that's probably sensible.
I think since learning it that I have ADHD as well, there's adjustments I've made in my life that I know have helped me. So I find that when I'm exercising and eating well, being conscious of how much sleep I have, my ADHD is so much easier to manage. And it's those days where I don't feel like I need the medication. Do you think there's truth in that?
So I think exercise, diet are huge things. I mean, I was talking before about sort of you need to train yourself to concentrate. Things like mindfulness, meditation. I know it's really hard to do. Impossible.
You're asking ADHD people to sit quietly and sit still.
But you don't have to sit quietly and sit still. Right? You could put on a guided meditation and walk. And I think that's the thing. It's how you combine something like a process of concentration with something that's more external and active, but you're still training yourself in that skill. So something like mindfulness is another skill that you would use in that context, but exercise, diet are really important things. I think the other thing that you've described there is routine.
Routine, but with flex.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I get bored if I do the same thing and repeat.
So have 10 routines. And you don't, I'm not saying that you have to have written out 10 different routines, but you've sort of got in mind that I go through these phases and I go through that phases, and that's okay. I think one of the biggest challenges is people with ADHD feeling that I have to be consistent. This is what we're always told throughout life, is that, you've got to put in your 10,000 hours. You've got to be consistent if you want to be brilliant at anything. And then if you fall off the wagon a bit, you think, oh God, I'm useless. I can't do it. But it's just sort of accepting, like, I'm going to change to a different gear for that. I'm going to do something.
Not every day.
Not every day. You can have your bursts and then you can do something else.
And I think as well with consistency, it's about showing up. Not that you should be at 100% every time that you show up.
Exactly. So many people with ADHD have struggled with routine because it's imposed on them. You know, it was the routine of school. It was the structure my parents wanted me to do. It's the structure of the working world. But you look at people who are successful, who have made it a superpower, they have nearly all got a routine of some shape or form. But it's your own. Yeah. And that's where I think it's aligning it with what's interesting to you. You need structure, but it needs to be yours. You know, if you decide what your structure is and you own it, then suddenly it's not like something that's chaining you and constraining your freedom. It's something that is actually liberating because it's taking you to where you want to go. So I think that if there is, you know, one thing that I think is really useful, it's sort of finding a way to build structure into your life in a way that aligns with you.
I agree. I love that. I also think that even some of the smaller things, like I never knew that I get sensory overload in crowded places. I always assumed this was an autistic trait, and I recently discovered that it's an ADHD trait. So when I have to come into Liverpool Street Station, that can send me into when I put my noise cancelling headphones on, I'm in a safe little happy bubble. And it's amazing of just knowing that and putting my headphones on changes the whole course of my day because I'm not exposed to something that can put me into an episode.
Absolutely.
So I think there's power in just
little things like that.
Little changes. Yeah. What can we do as a community to support the ADHD community?
I suppose I think it's really useful to share information so people know these are what the symptoms of ADHD are. But I think there's a lot of that happening right now, especially in our part of the world. Yeah. I think it's really useful to temper it a little bit as well and to think that I think it's really useful to have that conversation on how much of it is a disability, how much of it is a superpower. Can it be in the middle? Does all of that need diagnosis? Or can you just accept that actually there are certain ways of being, and until we've got another system in place that helps you to identify that I'm neurodiverse and these are good strategies for me, maybe you just know it, that actually a lot of this stuff aligns with me, and these are the strategies that work for people. Can I make use of those? And maybe you don't need the label to have the success to be able to make the change. I think for some people you definitely do, and it makes such a difference. But I think it's finding a way for it to for the knowledge about ADHD to increase without it excluding other people. With it being a lot, being inclusive, that you can all have some benefit from some of these things that we're saying. This isn't exclusive to us. We're going to have more benefit, but it's sharing that. I think that breaks down a lot of that thing of like, oh, you've got diagnosed with ADHD. Everybody can see the value to it.
They say that ADHD people are drawn to each other, that they know their own tribe. Is that true?
Don't know. I see a lot.
Know where this is going.
I think I definitely hear so many people with ADHD saying that their whole network, professionally, socially, have got ADHD or have got neurodiverse.
They tend to date each other, right, as well.
There seems to be a lot of it.
Yeah. Well, honestly, thank you so much for doing this. It's been amazing for me just to have this conversation, let alone for the people watching. It honestly means the world that you've taken time out of your day to come and do this. Thank you. I think it will help a lot of people.
Thanks very much.